On this week's Carrier Wrap, we speak with Dan Hayes from PwC Strategy and Division to get his views on 5G and the Internet of Things coming out of this year's Mobile World Congress event. Well, thanks for joining us in this week's Carrier Wrap. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. And this week, we are joined by Dan Hayes, who's a principal at PwC Strategy and Division, to talk a bit about the Mobile World Congress event that we just came out of. So, hey, Dan, thanks for joining us as always. We appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Very good. Well, you're almost kind of like our man on the street there when it comes to Mobile World Congress. I know we talked beforehand about what you thought might come from the event. I think as the event went on, perhaps it was a little bit slower than people were expecting, but again, still some items that came out of the event. So I guess maybe start off with just what were your general view of kind of what you saw out of the show this year?
Yeah, Mobile World Congress is always interesting, and there's always so much to see. Actually, when you say man on the street, it makes my feet hurt just thinking about it, because it's just such an enormous event, right? I don't think we've seen final numbers yet, but 120,000 plus of our closest friends. I think this year at Mobile World Congress, really the main story, the main takeaway for us was it was almost the absence of the consumer. Really, you could say, won't go so far as declaring death of the consumer, but you could say that the focus for this year was clearly on other things than the traditional, hot new sexy devices, or the really, interesting applications and accessories. They were there, and we'll talk a little bit about some of them. But I think this year what we saw was a bigger focus on the enterprise and IoT, and even some seemingly surprising things that led you to question how connected they were to mobile in the first place. Things like robots and drones. You could barely turn a corner without seeing them. So we see a lot of different things there, and I'll say, one that was really interesting to me, at least, was walking through the halls of the Fira in Barcelona. You almost would think that it was the Barcelona Auto Show.
Oh, wow.
There were so many cars and SUVs and trucks littered throughout the show. Talking about, applications, everything ranging from in-car communications and entertainment to a lot of things really focusing on autonomous vehicles. And lots of demonstrations from automakers, from application providers, systems integrators, and the OEMs, the network equipment OEMs themselves. So clearly there's a lot of attention being focused on alternative uses besides just the plain old traditional smartphone market at this point.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about the cars. I mean, that almost seems like what happened really at the Consumer Electronics Show. I mean, years and years ago, you would see a few cars on the floor there, but it seems like over the past several years, it's become almost like a car show. Like you said, everybody's kind of touting their connected car devices and things like that. And so it seems like it's kind of migrated itself over the ocean there over to Mobile Congress.
Yeah, there seems to be a bit of convergence. Probably the Consumer Electronics Show is getting a bit more enterprise, and Mobile World Congress is getting a bit more, generic connectivity focused. We see a lot of that over the last couple of years. One thing that I found particularly interesting at the show was this whole notion of focus on the enterprise. As we've seen in Mobile World Congresses of years past, there have also been a lot of growing focus on, there's only so many consumers in the world that we can connect to things, right? So we need to be thinking about how do people use this for work? How do we create new applications? Some of it bleeds into the Internet of Things, IoT, but there were some interesting applications. One that I found particularly fascinating was actually a connected watch. Now, connected watch is not super new, although this one was actually an LTE connected watch, not a Bluetooth one that was tethered to a phone. But the whole watch and the case that the manufacturer was making for its use was actually centered around the enterprise. And they had a really cool demonstration of where they had created a workflow for hospital workers. And so they weren't pitching this watch as, hey, this is a fashion accessory, or, you can get alerted when you get a new email. But this was actually a true enterprise-centric application where if you were a nurse doing your watch and you went around to all the different patients, you could actually log everything you were doing on the watch.
Mm-hmm.
You checked in on this patient, here were their vitals, all these types of things. Pretty clever, use in our view of a nice enterprise application for really what is an existing technology at this point. So you saw a lot of that around Mobile World Congress.
Interesting. I guess, does that have something to do with the fact that a lot of companies or operators and vendors are looking for more of the business model for a lot of this new technology? I mean, it seemed like, at least from covering from the outside, again, there wasn't a lot of that sexy news, but what was coming out was kind of almost, how can we make money off of this? Or how can this actually be a real thing? Not necessarily a consumer thing, but the enterprise, which typically has been kind of where a lot of the high revenues come from. I mean, obviously the consumer space is a large market, but the margins are usually a lot thinner there. Does it seem like, I guess, was there more of a focus on a business model for these types of things instead of just throwing out the flashy new things that are coming out?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say that certainly a big takeaway from Mobile World Congress was, what is the next generation of revenue growth going to come from?
Mm-hmm.
And you saw that manifest itself in the enterprise stuff, but you also saw it in some other interesting ways, right? You could argue that the connected cars that we just mentioned were all about where does that next generation come from, right? There's, 7 billion-ish people in the world. There's actually, a billion and I forget what it is, 1.4, 1.2 billion cars around the world. That's an interesting opportunity from a connectivity standpoint, right? If every one of those becomes a subscription or a usage base, you have a nice additional uplift in revenue there. So it makes sense why they were seeing it. Now, on robots and drones, you maybe have to squint a little more and say, well, exactly where is the revenue going to come from? Is that really material? Mm-hmm. But certainly there were a number of manufacturers and application providers that seemed to think this was there. On the robot side, some of it was really about enhancing the customer experience. So, you walk into your retail store maybe to go buy a new phone, or maybe you walk into a hotel and you got this connected robot there to help you with your needs from a customer service standpoint. Some interesting use cases there. On the drone side, certainly there's a lot of different applications that we're seeing coming for drones. And really the challenge with the drones and maybe the opportunity for the mobile operators is they throw off, especially from an imaging standpoint, a tremendous amount of data. And so their connectivity needs are very high. I think not a lot of people were really talking about whether drones were a great use case for mobile networks. Are they flying at the right altitudes? I mean, today we point our antennas down a little bit. Maybe we need to be pointing them up a little bit for drones. I'm not quite sure, but we definitely see an industry almost in a Hail Mary sort of play, looking for additional revenue growth opportunities around the world. So a lot of these are new ways they might be able to see. And we always see at Mobile World Congress some of these maybe crazy things come up, and in a couple of years you might not hear about some of them anymore.
Yeah, no, it's always pretty common for that to happen. There's always kind of those new things that come up, and within a year they're just kind of disappeared. So, but yeah, it's interesting. I know as we talked before the show, you'd mentioned you expected a lot in terms of the Internet of Things, IoT stuff in the event, and it does seem like there was quite a bit of talk about that. I guess coming out of the show, are you more confident in how the IoT market is developing and expanding, or do you think there's still some issues that need to be still need to be tackled? Or what's your view coming out of the show in terms of your kind of I guess confidence in IoT at this point?
Well, Mobile World Congress really confirmed exactly what we talked about earlier about IoT, which is the main struggle right now is really on use cases and the business case associated with them. It is back to your point of how are we going to make money with this?
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the bright side, I think there were many people at Mobile World Congress that seemed to be accelerating and proving out with trials or early implementations the whole IoT model. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we hosted an event called the Digital Revolution Summit at Mobile World Congress, and we had the CIOs of several prominent cities, including Barcelona, Hong Kong, Singapore, all talking about what they were doing in terms of smart cities and their use of IoT to really improve the performance of government and the way that they serve citizens. So that's really been one example of where IoT has been very productive already, and where it's really starting to show some quantifiable benefits, to the user base. We expect that that's going to grow. Smart cities is definitely a hot topic. It was a big source of conversation at Mobile World Congress as well. And I think many other IoT applications are similarly in that early stage of really trying to prove out the use cases, run some trials, and get them integrated. In some cases, it is challenging for the IoT, the equipment providers, the application providers, right? They have to stitch together, in some cases, a patchwork of providers, right? It's tough if you run vending machines on several continents. You're talking about a multitude of mobile network operators that you have to work with and interface with, maybe different standards, et cetera. So not quite there fully yet on IoT, but certainly a lot of focus being placed on it.
Interesting. I guess, and in terms of the IoT connectivity options, I mean, does it still seem like that mobile is going to be a large part of that? Because a lot of these, city type of things that are, if something is fixed, for instance, it doesn't really necessarily need a mobile connection. It can use a broadband connection or, fiber connection or whatever. Does it still seem like that's still kind of being worked through in terms of what role mobile will actually play in all this? And I should say cellular mobile, not just Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, an actual cellular connection to this. Is that still kind of being worked through at this point?
Definitely being worked through. The phrase that we hear thrown out a lot when it comes to that question is network of networks.
Yeah.
Think about IoT as really being somewhat network agnostic, and it really, the network connectivity being driven more by the use case and the location than anything. So we see hybrid solutions involving satellite, cellular, Wi-Fi, fiber, Bluetooth, cable connectivity, Ethernet, you name it, people are using it today. But it really depends on the case, right? If you're the long-haul trucker, cellular is probably not even going to do it. You're going to need at least some satellite backup, if not satellite as your primary connectivity. Whereas if I'm a smart thermostat in my house, Wi-Fi is probably just good enough, and there's really no need for me to consider, a cellular connectivity option at all.
Yeah.
But we're seeing a lot of that, and we're starting to see also, some of the integrators bringing some of these multi-technology solutions to bear so that you can integrate them into one device pretty easily where you need to.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting challenge because, like you said earlier, even just trying to integrate various cellular connections around the world, if you start to throw in, the various wired connections and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth as well, that creates a pretty complicated device, or potentially complicated device, in a market that's trying to bring the cost of those devices down as much as possible. So obviously, it'll become paramount for those device makers to really kind of fine-tune what they want to do with their device. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it'd be great to throw everything inside of one device, but that might not be financially feasible to do that. So obviously, you got to kind of pick and choose what you want to do.
Well, I think that's the rub for a lot of devices these days, right? The multitude of bands that they need to support, even for cellular connectivity, and then you add to that what they need to do for Wi-Fi, for satellite, right? It becomes pretty untenable at some point unless you're in just some extremely high value and really space unconstrained type of application.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess, do you see a lot in terms of, again, 5G? I know last year was big. It seemed like this year there was some 5G news as well, but it also seemed, at least from the outside, again, looking in, that there was almost as much talk about kind of the gigabit LTE stuff as well as 5G. I mean, it seemed like a lot of companies, I know Sprint initially, or Sprint when they were there, talked a bit about their gigabit LTE plans. So basically taking, 4G and adding the advanced features of LTE and making it what it was originally supposed to be, which was a gigabit speeds. And we're kind of getting there now finally. But I guess, how did you see kind of the, I guess 5G and also kind of the gigabit LTE kind of connections kind of playing out there as well?
Yeah, there were tons of demos on the floor and a number of announcements as well about both gigabit LTE and 5G. And at this point, the lines really are blurring quite a bit, between them. I think, what's clear is that the operators are looking for better scale, better, numbers of devices supported on a per location basis, and total bandwidth, as well. There's a lot of ways that we're going to get there. This year was really what we expected, which was more proof of concept, demo, kind of feasibility type of things. And, people starting to think about this on their roadmaps, But even when you look at the early adopters, right, the early adopters still confirmed, hey, next, call it 3 years or so, are largely going to be fixed wireless type of proof of concepts. And then, we start to bleed more around the 2020 and beyond time frame into true, 5G mobile type applications. We think actually it may well be, more of the beyond than the 2020. It definitely a lot of talk about that. I'll say the other thing that really was prominent and a big theme related to gigabit LTE and 5G was this whole notion of the network moving towards an entirely cloud-based virtualized structure. That was something we weren't expecting to see quite as much as we probably saw this year. And really, to me, the story is that network infrastructure is essentially going through the same commoditization that we saw with computing and storage infrastructure, 10 years ago. And what's clearly happening is that the OEMs are lining themselves up and lining their product lines up so that when people do go to this next generation, it doesn't look like what it looks like today. It essentially looks like a fully virtualized network. And in some cases, it's even a completely different business model where it may well just be everything as a service. And we may see the traditional OEMs lining themselves up to be the infrastructure owners and really providing that on a, pay by the terabit type of, service to the service providers themselves. So it sort of begs the question of what does the service provider of the future look like, right? If they're not all about owning and operating the capital equipment in the network. Yeah. Lots of talk about that. And, we're clearly headed in that whole virtualization, cloud-based direction when it comes to networks. So that's going to be pretty exciting to see over the next few years. We're already starting to see some trials. We're seeing some elements of networks moving in this virtualization direction already. The one that we always hear about as sort of the first step, because it's fairly easy, is virtualizing the firewalls. Yeah. That's been something a lot of people are already acting on, but certainly much, much more to come to that if Mobile World Congress is any indicator.
Yeah, it did seem like there's a lot of news about, SD-WANs and things in the enterprise space, virtualizing those type of things as well. So yeah, it did seem like the virtualization aspect is becoming a bigger part. Obviously, it's been going on for quite some time, but it seems like it's almost developing in unison with the 5G movement. And so yes. At some point, and you kind of need both. Well, you need software obviously for the 5G part of it. And so that development side by side at some point will cross paths, and you will get those actual deployments. And it's again, we're looking probably down the road a little bit, but it does seem like the networks of 10 years from now are going to be much different from the networks that we obviously 10 years ago, but obviously even today probably as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the reason that we see it lining up with 5G so nicely is that the virtualization actually will help to drive the CapEx, the initial CapEx outlay down, which of course has been one of our big concerns for the adoption of 5G, where we just see that we have such capital constrained operators around the world that if they can move in this virtualized environment and move in that direction, this is a great opportunity for them and could actually speed up the deployment of 5G a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and again, if you can target those enterprise markets, which traditionally have been good revenue generators for them, at least for the early services, that'll allow them to at least start generating some revenues early on in this move towards virtualization and 5G, and then kind of, it all kind of steamrolls and eventually goes out to the consumer market as well. But yeah, again, kind of packaging that all together to serve those big markets is a big part of it. So interesting to see how that'll happen out. But I guess it may be a surprise for you. I mean, were you surprised to not see again many big device announcements? I know, obviously, CES is kind of the big device show now, and Mobile World Congress is perhaps not the big device, the big device show that it used to be, but there still was very little in terms of, anything really announced there. I mean, Nokia had a small little device. Samsung obviously didn't announce anything there. LG had a device, I think, as well, but not a lot of big news device-wise. Was that any surprise at all, or is that just kind of the way things are today, where it seems like vendors are having their own specific events now to launch their own devices as opposed to going to big shows?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that, but I would say, overall, and I spent some time looking at all the major device vendors and looking at what they had announced. Overall, you really didn't see anything that was a particular breakthrough, right? And quite frankly, the quality of some of the devices really seems to be slipping as they try to go down market, right? We have very price sensitive, hyper competitive markets for devices, and you go and you rap on the back of some of those phones, and you're like, wow, this thing really feels like it's not going to make it a week, hanging out with me. The story of the devices at Mobile World Congress really had two things to it that I would say were notable. So one was a very uncanny focus, no pun intended, on photography. A lot of device manufacturers showing, what I would call feature level innovations when it came to photography and imaging. Clearly, that's become a big focus for consumers and end users, right? We're all using our phones effectively as the default camera in our life. Yeah. And so you saw a lot of things there. There were some interesting things. One that I saw that I thought was, kind of clever, but would it make me buy a different phone? Was actually predictive photography. So I guess they've come up with some algorithms that they know when you pick up your phone and you do a certain thing, you're likely to want to take a photograph. So they start taking photographs before you actually press the button. Pretty interesting. I thought that was innovative, clever, maybe a little good understanding of psychology.
Yeah.
And there were also some interesting photography accessories, I guess I would call them. Some things where, you got higher quality optics, better zoom, things like that you could kind of bolt on to the back of the phone as an accessory. That was pretty clever as well. But really, from a device standpoint, not a ton to talk about. Accessories, photography, kind of little incremental innovations, but nothing that was really breathtaking. And in fact, in many ways, the show lacked some of the really out there type of devices that we've seen in years past. It wasn't really anything with, a 40 megapixel camera or a device that had 3 different screens on it, right? You didn't see that stuff this year for the most part. Actually, the only real holdover from last year on the consumer side was the presence of virtual reality.
Yeah.
You still saw tons of VR demos, all over the place. But again, with very unclear connection to how carriers are going to make money. What does this really do? Does this really drive, mobile usage as opposed to LTE or just usage of the device? So not super exciting in many cases.
Yeah, maybe still a little early when it comes to virtual reality in terms of, like you said, the kind of the business model of the network support for that still seems like it's not quite there yet. But it always, brings up interesting demos. Like you said, I'm sure there was tons of crazy things happening there in terms of the demos for that. So I guess,
you could you could ride around on roller coasters and skydive and drive race cars, and monster trucks was, I think, the new one this year. You can go and drive a monster truck.
Interesting. I didn't know monster trucks were big in Barcelona, but now I know. So now next time I go there, I can look for the monster truck rally. So
there you go.
That's interesting. Well, again, Dan, it's always great to get some insight on what happened at the show. Again, it is such a big event, and don't mean to make your feet hurt by talking about that, but it seems like, again, like the crowds were big again this year. And obviously, the show maybe perhaps was not its traditional self and being, big on big devices and things like that. But with the crowds that are turning out for it, I guess what it is doing is at least stuff that's exciting or interesting to people out there, or maybe it's just the economy as well. But it does seem like it's still getting enough attention from at least participants there. So that's, I guess, a good thing for the event itself.
Absolutely. Well, it does continue to be the place to go for all things mobile. It really is, a great coming together of the industry, and even the government representation, right? The ministerial track there. It's a great way for the industry to do a lot of knowledge sharing, to connect, to talk about what's next, and it continues to be a really high impact event.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds good. Hey, Dan, again, always appreciate the time and insight, and hopefully we'll touch base again soon.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check out our next Carrier Wrap when we're scheduled to speak with Exploy on its work with LTE broadcast and recent developments across the market segment. Thanks for watching.